I'm going to start the show. Chris Speaks back here today with Brandon Mosley for our BCS State of Alabama podcast. We got Congressman Mo Brooks back with us today. Congressman, how are you, sir?
Doing fantastic. How about y'all?
Great.
Doing great, Congressman.
So, Congressman, right now we've seen that over the last week, Israel and Iran are at a war, or at least trading barbs. Do you think Iran was this close to getting a nuclear weapon, or was this part of a broader strategy of regime change after we've seen the president go to the Middle East and try to get Iran to, give up their nuclear weapons, and Saudi Arabia sign the Abraham Accords?
Well, as a preface, nobody knows for sure outside of Iran. It's my opinion that Iran, in a crash course type of environment, could have produced a nuclear weapon in a matter of weeks at a minimum, perhaps months at most. They're in the uranium enrichment phase of the process. The science is pretty well settled. There are a number of countries and scientists around the globe that have put nuclear weapons together. So, yeah, I believe Iran was on the cusp. And while that's dangerous, what's especially dangerous about Iran is that its leadership over the years have made some very, very dangerous and threatening comments about Israel and the United States of America. They view Israel as the little Satan, America as the great Satan, that they approach their anti-Israel, anti-America threats with a religious fervor, and that they are willing to sacrifice the people of Iran if in the process they have taken out Israel and the United States. Now, we haven't had a nuclear weapon killing people since 1945, the end of World War II in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which means that for roughly 80 years now, no one has been involved in the detonation of a nuclear weapon on an enemy's soil. And that's because of what's known as the MAD doctrine, mutually assured destruction doctrine, the gist of which is you don't dare attack us with nuclear weapons, because if you do, we'll launch ours against you and we'll both be dead. And nobody wants to both be dead. There is no winner in that kind of nuclear exchange. Well, when you've got a leadership of a country that is in pursuit of a nuclear weapon, not being subject to the MAD doctrine that has kept nuclear peace for 80 years, a government that is willing to sacrifice its own people to the tune of tens of millions, if in the process they can achieve Allah's goal, as they see it, of wiping out Israel and the United States, you can't let a country like that have nuclear weapons. You just can't.
Didn't over the weekend, when Iran fired missiles back at Israel, they unveiled that they had a maneuverable missile that was able to make in-flight adjustments and thereby beat the Iron Dome and get through, unlike most of their missiles, which are like Scuds, which, they go up and they go down, and you can sort of predict what they're going to do in flight, and so you can intercept them. The threat of Iran, which we now know has a maneuverable missile that can defeat most anti-ballistic missile systems currently available, combining that in theory with a nuclear warhead, added a whole different level of urgency to this, didn't it?
Well, I believe it's urgent even without that, because weapons defense systems, missile defense systems, are unpredictable. They're not 100%. And by way of example, if an international continental ballistic missile were to approach the United States, I'm fairly confident, high degree of confidence, that our military would not launch one interceptor, but instead would launch multiple interceptors on the chance that the first one or two don't hit. And that's with the most sophisticated weapon system missile defense system on the planet. And so, yeah, if the missile that is incoming has a direction change capability, that most definitely makes it more difficult for interceptors to intercept. But with the understanding that the interceptors we have now are not 100%. They're not foolproof. They do make mistakes. And as a consequence, some missiles get through. The difference with Iran being right now, they're firing conventional weapons. If they were to launch just one or two missiles that got within miles of their target in Israel, they could take out Tel Aviv, they could take out Haifa, they could decapitate the Israeli government, and they could do it in minutes.
Congressman, we've seen that it looks like that Israel is decapitating their military leadership and urging people to rise up. Is it possible for regime change without us arming, or without Israel arming these people? Do they have the means to overthrow this government?
Well, the answer to that question is dependent on a couple of things. One, how much animosity is there by the people of Iran against their government? And two, what revolutionary capabilities do they have? Do they have weapons with which they could topple, by way of example, the Iranian Republican Guard, okay, Revolutionary Guard, whatever it is? And I'm not sure that they have the weaponry to topple the Iranian government's military. In some nations, you can have mass demonstrations, and that causes the incumbent government to flee. But Iran's leadership has made it quite clear that they are willing to use barbaric, deadly force against anyone who resists their government, because they believe that their government is put in place with a mission from God. And that makes things a lot more difficult when you're talking about toppling a regime. So you tell me, do the people of Iran have their own weaponry with which to take out the governmental leadership, the forces that protect the governmental leadership? My understanding is that they do not. They do not have a First Amendment right to bear arms, or Second Amendment right to bear arms in Iran like we have in the United States. And so a weaponless society that wants to take out a government that has the weapons is going to lose.
With Iran, I think most of us are familiar with Islam, but they're, predominantly Shia, and the current Ayatollah practices more of a apocalyptic version of Shia Islam, where they believe that there were 12 imams, who are to rule the Muslim empire, and the 12 magically vanished and is waiting to come back. Is there a danger that the 86-year-old Ayatollah believes by incinerating Israel that golden age where Shia Islam takes over the planet could begin with the return of the 12th Imam? So they're not, mutually assured destruction isn't something they're really scared of.
It's quite clear from their statements. Now, it's one thing to make public statements, and it's another thing to harbor beliefs that are consistent with those statements. But their public statements are to the effect of being on a mission from God. And when you've got that kind of mandate, coupled with a corollary strong belief in an afterlife in which you are rewarded for having fulfilled the mandates of God, that makes them more dangerous with nuclear weapons than most any other government or groups of people on the planet.
Congressman, with we've seen that Israel has now achieved air superiority, and even though some of the missiles have struck in Tel Aviv, it's an amazing show to watch them strike, shoot down their missiles. Who do you think is feeling the more pressure now, the Iranian government or the Israeli government?
Oh, I don't think there's any question. I think it's the Israeli government. The Israeli government is a republic. It's elected. It's responsive to the people. And to the extent the Iranians can wear down the desire of the Israeli population to continue to engage in this warfare, then Iran can win simply because the government of Israel may collapse. Conversely, you've got dictators in charge of Iran who are motivated by a religious fervor, and you put those two things together, and that suggests that the only way you're going to be able to change them is to kill them, that they're not going to voluntarily sacrifice beliefs that they've held their whole lives. And so in terms of who's having the most military success right now, well, Israel is. But in terms of who can weather the storm for a longer period of time, if it's a war of attrition, well, Iran's got over 90 million people estimated. Israel has about 10 million. So 10, 11% of the population of Iran. In terms of square mileage, Israel is a very, very small country. It's 500-600 square miles. On the other hand, Iran is about 60, 70, 80 times larger geographically, at least. It might be in the hundreds times larger than Israel.
Yeah,
so
it's twice the size of Texas.
Well, Iran has a much larger geographic area in which its citizens can go to protect themselves, and a much larger population. So Iran, from a purely military standpoint, can afford the sacrifice of more lives in a war endeavor than Israel can. And you mentioned the size of Iran. Israel's smaller than the Tennessee Valley of Alabama. That's how tiny it is. In some parts of Israel, you can fly all the way across it in less than 5 minutes in some of the skinny parts, so to say. Yeah, Israel is right now doing more damage to Iran than Iran is doing to Israel. But Iran can afford more damage to it than Israel can afford to it. And of perhaps great concern in evaluating who's going to win long term is how many more interceptor missiles does the Israeli Defense Force have versus how many more missiles can Iran launch? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I am concerned about a shortage of interceptor missiles on the part of Israel.
President Trump is considering sending our bombers over to help Israel take out these nuclear facilities. Tucker Carlson and some, in the president's political coalition have strongly denounced any U.S. involvement in the Iran, Israel conflict. If the president gets involved in this, is there a possibility of it causing an irreparable tear in the MAGA movement?
Well, in terms of the MAGA movement, Donald Trump has shown a great deal of resiliency with his supporters. He's done things and he has said things that would have toppled previous campaigns and the respect for the office that a lot of politicians, including Donald Trump, have held. So his resiliency is quite remarkable. I thought in 2015 his campaign was over when he insulted unnecessarily John McCain in Arizona, attacking a war veteran who was heroic. Most candidates would not have survived that. Or his comment in October that came to light in October of 2016, right before the election, about women and their privates and the kind of things that he'd like to do or talk about. I thought that would have ended his campaign. And you may recall during one of his campaigns, I think it was in 2016, he bragged that he could go down Fifth Avenue shooting people and his supporters would still vote for him. That shows a high degree of commitment by his supporters to Donald Trump, regardless of what he does. So, we'll have to see how all this plays out. Tucker Carlson, on the other hand, one of the most disappointing things that I've seen over the last 50 years that I've been watching the news, reading the news, and being a student of politics is the change in the news media. And now the news media tries to micro-target an audience or a segment of the population by parroting back to the audience what that audience wants to hear, regardless of whether there's merit in the parroting back, okay? And in effect, then, they're getting paid to say certain things to attract certain audiences in order to make money. And I suspect, but don't know for sure, that Tucker Carlson is profiting by saying the things he says in favor of Putin and Russia and saying the things that he says in favor of Iran. Is consistent with a much larger problem we've got with the news media being paid to say certain things in order to attract certain audiences in order to get the advertising bucks that pays for the show. But that, again, I don't know that Tucker's doing that, but some of his statements are so off the wall, so contrary to logic, and so challenging to the interests of the United States of America. I strongly suspect that that's why he's saying some of the things that he's saying.
Congressman, changing gears here, we've seen that the big, beautiful bill is kind of losing steam.
I call it the big, bad bill, but go ahead.
Is that because it's going to blow up the debt, or why do you think it's losing popularity now?
Well, there's probably a motivation to oppose it behind every single paragraph in the bill. Some paragraphs will motivate a lot of people to oppose it. Some paragraphs will motivate a few people to oppose it. But to me, the biggest reason to oppose it is because it increases the risk of America having to work its way through a very dangerous and debilitating national insolvency and bankruptcy. We've got a $36 trillion debt. Roughly 20% of all taxes collected by the federal government now is being paid just to service the interest on that $36 trillion debt. And you've got an estimated $2 trillion in additional debt that's going to be added to that $36 trillion during this fiscal year. All of those things are horrific. And for Republicans to be passing legislation that makes our financial solvency even worse, that's an abomination. Now, if this were a Democrat Biden effort to increase our debt by this amount, the Republicans would be going ballistic in opposition to it. Unfortunately, it seems that the only bad debt in Washington is the debt that is incurred by your opposition party. And last time I checked, it doesn't make any difference if it's Republican debt or Democrat debt. It's still the American taxpayer that's going to be strangled by it in the long term.
Congressman, is there a danger that if they don't pass the big, beautiful bill, that the 2017 tax cuts will automatically expire and 80% of Americans will be paying more taxes?
No, because I believe that there is a danger, but I think it's a very minimal danger. And the reason I say it's minimal is because the Republicans control the House, they control the Senate. If you were to narrow legislation just to that one issue to prevent a tax increase in American people, I believe that it would pass the House and the Senate, would be signed by Donald Trump. So I can't say that with 100% certainty, but I can say that with a very high probability that one aspect of the big bag bill would pass, albeit traveling as part of another piece of legislation.
Congressman, do you think that these Republicans that are on board with it right now, that they're afraid to vote against the president because of the MAGA movement?
Absolutely. There's I'm not going to mention any names, but there are a number of Republicans who have a long history of voting against these big spending bills, who are cowering in their boots because they have seen Donald Trump be very effective at defeating good people in Republican primaries. And they don't want to be next. A lot of these people covet their jobs more than they covet doing what's right for America. Sad thing to say, but it's the way it is. They don't want to take the risk. Now, I admire the heck out of, I think it was Warren Davidson out of Ohio and Thomas Massie out of Kentucky, who stood by their principles and, regardless of political party, voted to minimize the risk of a national insolvency and bankruptcy. But in our Alabama delegation, at least to date, every single one of them has been voting for debt increases when it's Republican debt increases. If you go back to 2023 and 2024, they're voting against these Democrat big spending bills. But now that it's their own big spending bill that they're not bothering to pay for, they support them. That's hypocrisy, and that's not good for our country.
Congressman, here in Alabama, U.S. Senator Tommy Tuberville has declared, that he's running for governor. And the only Republican who has qualified, or announced that he's going to qualify is Ken McPeters, an insurance agent out of Birmingham that's not real well known. Do you anticipate, especially since Ainsworth, decided to bail out, us having a competitive governor's race, or is it just going to be Tommy Tuberville just accepted as the governor candidate without serious opposition?
Well, let me mention two things. First, your ability to affect America and your ability to help Alabama is far greater in the United States Senate than it is in the governor's office. That's just the way it is. I'll use one example, which some people might want to quibble with, but how many buildings in Alabama are named after a governor whose last name is not George Wallace, which means you're going back decades, okay? Now, how many buildings are named after Richard Shelby? Granted, it's a lot of pork barrel, but there are a lot of Alabama edifices named after Richard Shelby. It's almost like that was a requirement to get money. You had to massage his ego and name the building after him at our institutions of higher education in particular. Now, as a senator, you affect the economy to a much greater degree. You affect everything that affects the daily lives of Alabamians to a much greater degree. If you go to the governor's position, that is a definite downgrade if you're trying to influence public policy that affects the lives of Alabamians. Second, is Tommy Tuberville going to win? He's very well liked by a significant number of Republicans and independents, and there are probably even some Democrats. And if he wants to be governor, all indicators at this point are that he's going to do very well in that endeavor during the election process. And I should emphasize something else. He might be disappointed when he becomes governor, because very quickly he finds out that under the Alabama Constitution and state law, the Alabama governor's position is about the weakest in the country. Sure, you've got a megaphone, a big podium where you can make public statements, but what's the ability to impact legislation? What's the ability to impact public policy? You don't have a vote in the House or the Senate. The only real effective way you can impact votes in the House and the Senate is to threaten to take away road projects or to promise to give road projects or to promise or threaten to use that megaphone that the governor's office has in some kind of media comment about liking or disliking the votes of certain people. But that's about it in terms of public policy. Sure, the governor's got a veto, but in Alabama, it's not like the president. In Alabama, to override a veto, you only need a majority vote of the House and of the Senate. It's not like in the United States Congress, where it takes, if I recall correctly, a 2/3 majority to override a presidential veto. Under those circumstances, a president has a big effect on public policy because anything that is controversial is relatively split 50-50 or 55-45, maybe even 60-40, and the president can kill any of those things with a presidential veto. But in Montgomery, if a governor vetoes something, all it takes is a majority of the members of the House of Representatives, that's 53, to override the veto, and then 18 out of 35 senators to override the veto. Now, there is a personal life aspect to this that I think is probably Tommy Tuberville's primary motivation. Washington, D.C. is not a good place to live. It's not a good place for your family. It's not safe. It's expensive. And if you enjoy your spouse and your kids and your grandkids, then it's a real sacrifice to be in Washington, D.C. And as I understand it, Tommy Tuberville wanted out of Washington, D.C. because that was not a lifestyle that he found enjoyment in. And as a little bonus, Montgomery is a whole lot closer to his home in Florida and his home in Auburn. Okay? So he's got two houses that he can easily reach if he is serving as governor of the state of Alabama, one on the beach and one at Auburn. Much more difficult to get to if you're in Washington, D.C.
Congressman, do you think some of this may be egocentric as well? Because in D.C., he's one of 100. In Alabama, he's going to be on the stage as the one person here in front of our citizens.
Yeah, well, that's another part of the job that he might not find as enjoyable, because what the governor often finds the governor doing is sitting in a car for long trips around the state to go to some meeting or some happy event where you're really not doing anything other than sitting through it and maybe making a few happy remarks about, say, a new business opening up or a new business expand. Those are good things, don't get me wrong. I'm more of a policy guy, driving around the state where I'm sitting in a car for many hours and then going to a place where you sit in a chair for some extended period of time. That's just not enjoyable. I'm more of an active person. I want to get up and do things. And as a senator, to me, you just have a bigger effect on public policy, and the subjects that you're focused on are public policy, the pros and cons, what's in the best interest of your country and your state. While as a governor, you're just not doing that. It's almost like a semi-retirement. Look at Kay Ivey. How active has she been in public policy matters during her years as governor? Oh, occasionally, but really not very much. It's a semi-retirement for her. And that's the way she's looked at it. And she's delegated a lot of authority to perhaps her chief of staff, perhaps her office personnel. And I'm happy for those folks who want a job like governor of the state of Alabama, but I can tell you right now, if they gave it to me, I wouldn't take it.
In the Senate race, there's a lot of names swirling around. Steve Marshall and Jared Hudson are the only two people that I'm aware of who qualified as Republicans. But I'm hearing like another 5 or 6 names thinking about it, or people are talking about them thinking about it. Do you anticipate this really being a free-for-all with, 5 or 6 guys getting into this?
I would anticipate that you'll have at least 2, 3, 4 quality candidates, candidates who either have name recognition or financial backing that makes it a more competitive race than it appears to be right now. By way of example, when I ran for the Senate in 2022, for 2 or 3 months, it was me and some nobodies that the public had never heard of. So the polling all had me way up. But then some somebodies came in, one of which was a war hero who put in over $10 million of his own money. He by himself with his own money that he made off of defense dollars outspent me. And then, of course, you had another one who came in with a lot of special interest money approaching $40 million. And so you can change things pretty quick when you have that kind of money. Now, will that kind of money pop up in this Senate race? I suspect so. Of course, you have to look at the way things are going to play out. And it appears that Steve Marshall is the lead dog at the moment, but it's a race, and we'll see who all jumps in. But again, I expect at least one, maybe two, maybe even three people have an actual shot at winning running.
Is it possible we could see Congressman Brooks go at it a third time?
It's possible. The one advantage I have is name recognition. A disadvantage is I'm not going to be a puppet for Donald Trump. I'm going to vote what I think is in the best interest of America. And quite frankly, I think Donald Trump needs some people in Washington, D.C. who will explain to him that some of his ideas are off the wall, or some of the things he says he shouldn't say in his own best interest and in the country's best interest. But the only decision I have made is that I'm not going to decide until much later in the process. I'm nowhere near making a decision. And quite frankly, some of the things I'm going to look at and deciding whether I'm going to jump into that Senate race, do we have someone in the race who I am comfortable will do what it takes to prevent a national insolvency and bankruptcy of a great nation? A national insolvency and bankruptcy that would make us second or third tier in terms of influence around the globe and wealth in America. In that vein, I want to see where we are months from now. The economy, we've got this tariff war where it's like a ping pong ball, and the tariffs seem to change on a daily basis. And the strategy, as I have seen it, is not very well thought out and not very well implemented. And how is that going to affect the economy? What's the unemployment rate going to look like? What is the gross domestic product going to look like? What is what are interest rates going to look like? What is inflation going to look like? There are a bunch of different things. I want to see how that plays out. And then I also want to see how things unfold internationally. In my opinion, it's horrific how much Donald Trump has snuggled up to a brutal, evil, megalomaniac killer by the name of Putin in Russia, and how much his hate because Ukraine did not go out of its way to help Donald Trump win his election in 2019 and 2020, how much Donald Trump holds a grudge against Ukraine and betrays what was formerly an American ally. I want to see how that plays out. So there are a lot of things I want to look at. And I would add that when I talk about these issues, I very strongly prefer a candidate who has been in the legislative fight and has established a track record such that you know they will do the right thing for their country, no matter the pressure from special interests, from money groups and others to do the wrong thing. And right now, there's nobody in the race that has that kind of track record that you can look at and have some degree of comfort that they're going to do what America needs doing. Now, that's not to denigrate the people who are already announced. They may do what America needs doing, but I'd feel a whole lot better if they had had track records where they'd been in the heat and the battle in a legislative process and proven that they had the backbone and the mettle to do what it takes to protect America.
Congressman, when President Trump was elected, he's predicted that he would make peace between Russia and Putin, on the first day of the election, of him being sworn in, or, I mean, shortly thereafter. We're now 6 months into this presidency, and it doesn't look like a deal between Ukraine and Russia is on the horizon. Hope I'm wrong on that, but it doesn't look like he's going to be able to get the two of Zelensky or Putin to agree to a deal where they give up, either one of them gives up any of the territory they want, and they want the same territory. Does that put us in a bind where we're having to supply Ukraine with things like, anti-aircraft missiles and anti-ballistic missiles in their war against the Russians, while we're supplying the same thing to Israel in their war against Iran? And then there's the possibility yet that the United States may get involved in the Iran-Israel thing, and we may need some of those missiles ourselves. Do we have the productive capacity on producing, things like missiles and ordnance that, we can essentially be supplying two major wars while fighting one ourselves?
Well, you brought up a lot of topics. Let me bring attention to the first one, where you talked about Donald Trump's campaign promise to end the Ukraine-Russia war. First, I don't think he ever told anybody that what he meant when he was saying that during the campaign was that he was going to force Ukraine's surrender in whole or in part. If he had added those words, that he was siding with Russia and Putin, then he might not have done as well in the election and might not have won it. But he didn't tell people that. He just said he's going to bring peace, apparently no matter the cost and no matter whether it is the enemy that has been successful. But I focus on that to emphasize this one thing. No one should trust anything Donald Trump says. In my time as a state legislator, I was elected 4 terms to the legislature, elected 4 times as a Madison County commissioner, served as Madison County District Attorney for 2 years, elected 6 times, served 12 years as United States Congressman. So I've interacted with well over 1,000 public officials that the public has put in office and had me interact with, okay? And none of them have proven to have been as unreliable and as dishonest as Donald Trump is. So that's just the way Donald Trump is. That's part of his character. He says these things that are off the wall, where there's no basis of fact. And he and I split up in February, March of 2022 when he wanted me to lie to the American people about using force to remove Joe Biden from the White House. And he'd been in the White House for over a year by this time, okay? To forcefully remove Joe Biden from the White House, to forcefully reinstate Donald Trump into the White House, and to call a special election for President of the United States. And I wasn't going to lie to the American people about whether that's legal or illegal. And that's what he wanted me to do. And it wasn't long thereafter that he unendorsed me because I wouldn't lie for him. Okay. And apparently that's a criteria. You have to be willing to do that. And unfortunately, some of his buddies have ended up in jail and losing lawsuits because they did not lie for him, or because they did lie for him. I should say, when they did not lie, they lost their jobs. That's typically the way he handles those things. He just fires them. Now, back to the thrust of the question, though. And the thrust is, do we have the military weaponry? We have fairly large stockpiles of national defense weaponry, but there are limits. And if Israel starts consuming quantities of American weaponry in excess of what we have scheduled for production, or if you add on to it, if the United States intervenes itself and we have direct involvement in attacks on Iran, or should the president start keeping America's commitment to Ukraine rather than breaching it. And by keeping it, I'm talking about assisting Ukraine with weaponry it needs to defeat a very bloody aggressor nation and dictator in Putin. Then, yeah, we're going to have to up production. And there are limits to production capacity. Can we expand production levels beyond what they are right now? Yes. But depending on the particular weapon, I don't know by how much and which weapons we can rapidly increase production on and which weapons there'd be a time lag for increased production on. But we can produce more weapons. But as with all things, it takes money and it takes time.
Congressman, we hear, last on the 14th we had the No Kings rally, and I see people on Facebook talking about they're trying to defend democracy, even though we're a constitutional representative republic. Last November, we seen President Trump win the popular vote as well as the Electoral College. Are these people not trying to thwart the very democracy they say they're trying to save by going out here with this opposition?
No, I don't think so. I think what they're doing, by and large, is trying to impact the 2026 and 2028 elections. What is past is in the past, okay? You can't change the 2024 election outcome at this point in time. Again, that's part of Donald Trump's beef with me. He got very, very angry when I gave a speech in Coleman in August of 2021, in which I stated that the election is over with and we can be angry about the voter fraud and the potential of election theft, but we need to focus our anger on winning in 2022 and 2024. And he wanted to go backwards and redo the 2020 election, even though doing so would be in direct conflict with the United States Constitution and applicable federal statutes. And so I tried my best to explain to him, Mr. President, that's not being honest. Legally, there is zero route, zero path by which you can do what you want. Forcefully take Joe Biden out of the White House, forcefully move you back into the White House and make you president and then hold a special election. It's impossible legally to do. And you saw the result.
20 years ago, we went into, Afghanistan to punish the Taliban and kill Al-Qaeda guys because of 9/11. That morphed into we need to do a regime change and install a Western-style democracy over here in Afghanistan where, the average person doesn't live on $700 a year. And in Iraq, we went in to take out Saddam Hussein because he was causing problems and we wanted him gone. And then that morphed into, we need to install a Western-style democracy and, somehow make peace between the sectarian divisions with Iraq. Both of those missions, the Afghanistan one especially, ultimately proved, there are limits even to American military power. If we go into Iran, shouldn't the mission simply be to take out their nuclear facilities and eliminate, however much of their nuclear production facilities that we can degrade through the air, rather than, adopting more lofty goals, that might actually involve American troops on the ground?
Well, I'm one of those that believes that you need to learn from the past. And if you don't learn from the past, you're going to repeat it. That's why I've taken the kind of strong stance on Ukraine versus Russia. I see Putin as another Hitler. And if you recall Hitler, there were 4 or 5 conquest of territories in Europe before Western Europe finally took him seriously. And by then, he had added to his war machine fighting population, because he had the populations of those conquered regions. He had added to the resource base that he could use to maintain the war machine. And it was a bad mistake with Chamberlain. He's the prime minister of the United Kingdom, to do nothing until Germany had gotten so strong. The war was very much protracted and helped contribute to over 50 million dead civilians and military personnel in World War II. So that's the reason I have the position on Ukraine. And I have a similar thought about Islamic nations. America needs to learn that Islam really is different. And Muslims really do think differently than most American citizens. And Muslims don't necessarily, well, they don't agree with all provisions in the United States Constitution or all provisions in the Bill of Rights. When I say that, there are some exception individuals, but by and large, Islam is in conflict with our Bill of Rights in a variety of ways, most particularly freedom of religion. So we failed to nation build in Iraq. We failed to nation build in Afghanistan to the extent we were trying to do that in both of those two nations, and we did to some degree. But we need to take those failures into account when we decide how we're best going to address Iran. So having said all that, I agree with you 100% that if the United States is going to be involved, it needs to be limited to the total and complete destruction of Iran's nuclear capability and leave Iran to Iran. Might there be a regime change? Possibly. Might we want to encourage one? Yeah. But it still needs to be a regime that the Muslims of Iran won't. Otherwise, we'll be fighting them indefinitely. And I don't want to fight the people of Iran indefinitely. There are a lot of good people in Iran, okay? We have different religious values, I get that. But there's still a lot of good people in Iran. And we need to do whatever we can to help those people install the kind of government that they want to install. And if they're not willing to fight for the kind of government that they want to install, well, then so be it. But it's not up to us to make that kind of change. You know, with America, it was the American citizenry that had to fight for the kind of government that we wanted. And we welcomed the assistance of France, much like Iran citizens may welcome whatever kind of assistance would give them that would help them determine the kind of government that they want. But that's what we need to do. And anything beyond that, assisting Iranians to put in their own government that they can sustain, that the population supports, or the total destruction of Iran's nuclear capability, anything beyond that, and I'm talking specifically long-term commitments of boots on the ground, we should reject. And even with boots on the ground, if it's going to be short-term, it needs to be limited to the destruction of nuclear capabilities, a quick in and a quick out. And hopefully we'll do a whole lot better than Jimmy Carter did in 1980, trying to rescue the American embassy hostages in Tehran.
Congressman, the polls are all over the place. I've seen some with the president, 10 points favorabilities, other 15 points underwater. Same with immigration and the economy. But one seems consistent is no matter how bad he seems to be doing, the Democrats are 40 points underwater. And they keep doubling down with AOC, Kamala Harris, and David Hogg. Are they setting themselves up to defy the norm and get hammered in the midterm elections as opposed to Republicans losing seats?
Look, Donald Trump is not president of the United States because he has good moral values. Donald Trump is not president of the United States because he has a good understanding of public policy and the cascading effects of the things that we do at a governmental level. Donald Trump is not president of the United States for a variety of different reasons, but he is president of the United States because he is the most effective politician I've ever seen at self-promotion and the most effective politician I've ever seen at denigrating his opponents to the point where a growing mass of the citizenry hates him. And because of that hate for the other party, they vote for Donald Trump. Okay. And so Donald Trump has done a magnificent job of helping to expose what the Democrats stand for on a variety of moral issues, in particular, sexual issues, where most people understand the biological differences between men and women. And unfortunately, Democrats just can't seem to grasp that concept. And he's done a very good job of exposing the Democratic Party's weakness on border security and on law and order. And as Donald Trump continues to expose the Democrats on a number of public policy positions that are held in high contempt by a significant majority of the American people, well, then the Democrats are going to be swimming in the toilet on the polls. And that's going to help us in 2026. Now, can the Democrats recover? I'm sure they're going to do their utmost. But when they take on Donald Trump on this type of subject, they're taking on a master. And give credit where credit's due. Donald Trump's president of the United States because of those two attributes, self-promotion ability and ability to define his opposition. And I've never seen anything like Donald Trump in public life.
Congressman, we've held you for over 50 minutes here. I really have anything else to add. Do you, Christopher?
I got one more question for him. Congressman, the first time I ever heard him speak, I kind of got cold chills. And then after I started watching more, I sent these clips to him comparing him to another politician. And my friend first said, "No, you're crazy." And after he listened to him, he said, "I think you're on to something here." When you look at Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, and even this one with his law and order message against the establishment, there's no doubt in my mind he took George Wallace's 68 and 72 campaigns and ran them to a T. What do you think about that?
Well, Donald Trump's strength is marketing. And since he's not honest, he's apt to say anything, which means he is excellent at pandering to voters. And he's able to do it in a persuasive way where a lot of voters are snookered into believing that he actually believes it. Okay. I'll give you one example of my first up close interaction with Donald Trump. It was February or March of 2017. The issue was Obamacare. And some of us conservatives had said, wait a second. According to the Congressional Budget Office's report on this bill, HB1, which was to repeal and replace Obamacare, that Donald Trump and House Speaker Paul Ryan were pushing really, really hard, it was going to increase insurance premiums on American workers by more than 20% over and above the increases of Obamacare. And we said to Paul Ryan and to Donald Trump, look, we're not going to vote for a bill that's going to expand Obamacare. That's not what we promised. We don't care how you want to market it. We care what the substance is. And so Donald Trump does what he does. He threatened to primary me and every other person in the House of Representatives who was opposite him on this expansion of Obamacare. And finally, it reached a boiling point where he called us to the White House. And so there are about 20 or 30 of us who are principled conservatives who weren't going to renege on our campaign promises to repeal Obamacare. And then you had everybody who was anybody in the administration, their entire cabinet, the president, the vice president, their legislative liaison staffers who were pushing these things. Just anybody who was anybody was on the opposite side. And so I'm sitting in the cabinet room, and over President Trump's shoulder, I can see the Rose Garden. Okay. And Trump sits there, and we talk about the public policy effects of this legislation that Paul Ryan had persuaded Donald Trump to support. And you can see that Donald Trump is getting angry. He's steaming, he's fidgeting, he's staring at people. And finally, after about 15 or 20 minutes, he says the first thing he said during that entire meeting, he said, quote, "I don't give a shit about the policy. I just want to win," end quote. And I was floored. I was stunned because I thought the way you won was by doing what's best for the American people. And the way you do that is you care about the public policy and you make sure you got good public policy rather than bad public policy. So you've got your experience with Donald Trump. That's my first one where he's up close and personal and he's eyeballing me and a number of other congressmen who are insistent that we're not going to just discard our campaign promise to repeal Obamacare like that. And as a little epilogue or footnote, finally, Paul Ryan and Donald Trump surrendered because they knew we weren't going to move from the positions that we held based on principle. And they challenged us to get the votes in the House of Representatives to get through what we wanted through. And lo and behold, we did that. We mustered the votes when they both said there's no way in the world you can get what you want. Unfortunately, that was the bill that John McCain did the thumbs down on as retaliation for Donald Trump 2 years earlier having insulted his bravery and heroism.
Congressman, thank you so much for coming on today.
Y'all have a good one.
Have fun at the lake tomorrow.
You too, Congressman.
Take care.